Hello and welcome to the Together for the Common Good podcast channel. My name is Jenny Sinclair. I'm the founder and director of the UK Christian charity Together for the Common Good. And this is a podcast where we explore what the common good means in practice and how it can help us work towards civic and spiritual renewal. We're continuing to invite speakers who, drawing on the tradition of Catholic social thought, can help us consider common good questions about what it means to be human, the economy, work, our relationship with nature, freedom, civic participation, social peace, and much more. All of these areas need our attention in this time of profound change. In this episode, we're going to hear from Dan Hitchens, whose talk, Useful Lives, explores the advance of assisted suicide as not only a legal and medical matter or a matter of choice, but as a turning point. This is a new time. We at Together for the Common Good recognise that the hyperliberal philosophy of our collapsing era has failed in economic, social and moral terms, and the crisis is real. Serious questions lie before us. How can we restore our common life? And how can we stay human? And how can we move forward when opinion is so dramatically divided? Our Staying Human series addresses these big questions. I began by asking Luke Bretherton to help us think about human agency by reimagining the spirit of the commons. I then asked Maurice Glassman and John Cruddas to help us think about what reforms to statecraft and political economy are needed to help us stay human. I then asked Susanna Black-Roberts to explore what it means to be a person in the age of AI. And you can find recordings and texts of the whole series at t4cg.substack.com. But now we turn to matters of life and death, to reflect on what it means to stay human in an age that prizes individual choice over the common good. We can see that our individualistic culture regards the human being as a rights-bearing, autonomous individual. But that's a false anthropology, so different from the Christian understanding where we are relational beings made in the image of God. This falsehood has affected everything, what it means to care for each other, and including how we understand life and death. We need to go beneath the surface and explore exactly what is going on. So I thought, who better than Dan Hitchens to open this up for us? Dan is a senior editor at First Things magazine, but as a freelance journalist, his moral and constant scrutiny of assisted suicide debate has been outstanding. Not only as a writer, but as a person, Dan has a deep sensibility for interpreting the wisdom of Catholic tradition with great subtlety and for making connections between the national condition, grounded storytelling, and profound ethical truth. His writing has appeared in The Spectator, The Times, Compact, Unheard, The Critic, The Wall Street Journal, The New York Times, and formerly he edited The Catholic Herald. Both Dan's talk and the Q&A afterwards bring home a difficult truth, that assisted suicide isn't just a matter of choice, it's a turning point. So now, let's hear from Dan.
Thanks very much for that introduction, Jenny, and thank you for inviting me along to what's been a superb series, I think. The first time I spoke on this subject was at a North London theatre earlier this year, where I took part in a panel discussion after a play about assisted suicide. At the end of the discussion, the chair turned to me and the representative from Dignity in Dying and asked us both to state the best argument for the other side. So I gave it my best shot. I said, if someone you love is very close to the end, in terrible pain, and they look you in the eye and say, please, please, I just want it to be over. it seems very harsh that you have to say, sorry, that's not possible. Then the chair turned to the pro-assisted suicide activist and said, well, what's the best argument against changing the law? And the activist reflected for a couple of seconds. And bear in mind, this was at the end of the whole discussion, and then said, no, I really don't understand why anyone would be against it. That was frustrating, but on the other hand, at least they were being honest. Whereas the argument I gave, I don't think really is a strong argument for changing the law. Anyway, that failed exchange summed up for me the impasse in the debate over assisted suicide. It is often as though both sides have in their mind a single image. For proponents of legal change, the image of the terminally ill person in their last days who just wants to foreshorten their suffering. For opponents, the image of the lonely, bewildered, or depressed person ill enough to meet the legal definition of terminal and perhaps facing some subtle unspoken pressure. It's inevitable, I suppose, that the debate focuses on those two paradigms. For many parliamentarians, the key question is whether, in granting a right to the first group, they will create too much collateral damage in the second. That is the heart of the parliamentary debate, and there is no more important debate in British politics at the moment. And as the Lord scrutinises this bill, which has been going on today, the second day of committee stage, it is a debate in the balance. But given 45 minutes and this bold series title, Staying Human, I wanted to step back from that debate just a little, or rather to put it in a longer perspective. I want to go back to before Kim Leadbeater proposed her bill, before Lord Falconer proposed the first of his assisted suicide bills in 2009, before anyone in this room was born, before the Voluntary Euthanasia Society, which became Dignity in Dying, was founded, before David Hume defended suicide or Thomas Aquinas condemned it, before the death of Socrates, and in fact, before recorded history begins. The last of the 12 labours of Heracles, as you'll remember, was to capture the three-headed dog Cerberus from the gates of Hades, which Heracles did. When he returned, however, it was not to a hero's welcome, but to the vengeance of his old enemy, the goddess Hera. She drove him mad to the point where he killed his wife and children in a frenzy. When he awoke from this psychotic fit and saw what he had done, he resolved to take his own life. As Euripides tells it, Heracles, tied to a pillar to restrain him, says, "Alas, why should I spare my own life, since I've become the murderer of my own beloved children? Why wouldn't I hurry to leap from a steep rock or aim a sword at my guts, thus avenging the blood of my sons?" In May 1982, a classics student at Oxford, Edith Hall, was reading this play as a set text for her finals exams, just as her life seemed to be falling apart. Since her teens, she struggled with suicidal ideation. That year, a friend of hers and one of her tutors had both died by suicide. And she became increasingly obsessed with this thought that they'd taken this way out. She'd just been through a bad breakup and had, quote, sunk into a pit of murky despair as she approached her finals, weighed down by the expectations of her family, a family itself plagued by a history of suicide. One day, she almost threw herself under a bus, then collapsed in the street. Recovering from her breakdown, she read and reread Euripides' play about the suicidal Heracles. Above all, she reread the scene where Heracles' friend Theseus comes to the stricken hero to listen to his desperate anguish and to point the way out of it. Theseus' response to Heracles is a mixture of deep sympathy, attentiveness, affection, physical closeness, hope, wise advice, and, at points, quite sharply worded argument. It has, Edith Hall writes, a level of psychological sophistication about suicide hardly ever equaled since. It probably saved my life in May 1982. There's one thing in particular in this exchange that the suicidal Heracles has with Theseus that I want to pick out here. Theseus makes various attempts to console Heracles at first, which Heracles kind of bats away. So just look at my situation, obviously. I want to take my own life. But then Theseus begins to talk of Heracles' reputation as a benefactor to humanity and as a hero. And he tells him this: Greece will not allow you to die so stupid a death. Edith Hall says, the implicit argument here is that Heracles is still needed by his wider community. Now, this is a thought that runs all the way through the literature on suicide, throughout the historical treatments of this by philosophers in particular, that it is not, in fact, a merely personal matter, or a question which can be settled by an appeal to autonomy. Of course, there is a theological version of that point, but there is also a non-Christian, even a wholly secular version, which says that one person's death, and especially one person's suicide, is an event in their family, in their community, in their country, you might say in the whole human race. The debate over Kim Leadbeater and Lord Faulkner's bill is, needless to say, not about the philosophy, the ethics, let alone the legality of what you could call unassisted suicide. Nobody, me included, wants to relitigate Section 1 of the 1961 Suicide Act, which decriminalised the act of suicide. The debate that's happening in Parliament is about Section 2 of the Act, which currently prohibits encouraging or assisting suicide. And that's what would be, in part, lifted by this legislation. Nevertheless, it would be strange if the history and philosophy of suicide had nothing to tell us about the laws governing assisted suicide. Even those who want to distinguish between the two things, and we'll get onto that point later, have to accept that there is some grey area in between suicide and assisted dying, an area which their safeguards are intended to demarcate. Inasmuch as people have a picture in their minds of the history of thought about suicide, it might go something like this. In the classical world, suicide was essentially acknowledged as legitimate, sometimes even noble, as in the case of Socrates and Lucretia. But then, according to the conventional story, with the advent of Christianity, the moral assumptions flipped and suicide came to be seen as a grave offence. But as we've secularised since the Enlightenment, that old prohibition has lost its force. But is that the full story? About 15 years ago, the historian Jennifer Michael Hecht went through a traumatic double bereavement. Two friends of hers in succession killed themselves. Hecht, who is, by the way, a strong critic of organised religion, wrote a widely read piece for the Boston Globe in which she frankly urged the suicidal to stay alive. Her book is called Stay. And she said that the traditional disapproval of suicide, quote, must have helped keep 1 billion moments of anguish from turning into calamity. And she began to search the historical record for a secular case against suicide. And she found that the classical period wasn't just a time when people basically thought this was a reasonable way out. Socrates himself said that suicide was wrong and probably didn't consider his own final act to be technically a suicide. Greek tragedy often treats it as a disaster, as we've seen. And Aristotle argued against suicide on the grounds that the self-killer commits an injustice. Against who? An injustice against the state, or as Hecht paraphrases it, against the community. Aristotle doesn't go into detail on this, but the subsequent philosophical tradition is permeated by this thought that suicide is not just an individual decision. And the Enlightenment, as Jennifer Michael Hecht shows, was not an era when secular thinkers dispensed with an old irrational prohibition on suicide. It's more of a debate between two different understandings of what we owe to one another. David Hume, in his 1755 essay of suicide, argues that the act is praiseworthy if it relieves a burden on others. This is the pro-suicide bit of the Enlightenment. He writes, "Suppose that it is no longer in my power to promote the interest of the public. Suppose that I am a burden to it. Suppose that my life hinders some person from being much more useful to the public. In such cases, my resignation of life, i.e. suicide, must not only be innocent, but laudable." Hume adds that, helpfully, most people who are suicidal are those who are least useful to everyone else, the ones who lack health or power or authority, which is not the last time that suicide would be justified for those seen as useless. However, there are other major figures of Hume's era who have definite credentials as representatives of the Enlightenment, who take a very different view. Denis Diderot wrote in this context that it was impossible for anyone to be wholly useless to society. And Rousseau has a character say in a debate on suicide, every man is useful to humanity by the very fact that he exists. So the secular case against suicide is not just about the trauma caused by the act. It's something else. Wittgenstein, another interesting person in this tradition, said, if suicide is allowed, then anything is allowed. If anything is not allowed, then suicide is not allowed. And Jennifer Michael Hecht thinks the implication of this is that inasmuch as we have any kind of moral code, it's grounded on the sense that life matters. She quotes the thought attributed to Maimonides that he who destroys himself destroys the world, and says this: "It is a profound proclamation, dependent on a profound vision of our interdependence," a word Jenny used. "The human world is held together by our optimistic trust that life matters to others, and that the things we do in concert with them, even just living, are invested with that meaning. With a suicide, what is taken away is not only the person's presence, but also her faith in life mattering, her hope in life, and her attachment to the future." Our actions don't only have emotional consequences, they also have a meaning. And they have an impact on the shared meaning that links our lives with those of others. Suicide, and I imagine almost everybody in this room has witnessed this even at second or third hand. Suicide seems to cancel meaning. Karen Green, the widow of the novelist David Foster Wallace, who took his own life, said of her bereavement, "Life becomes another code, a language that you don't understand." Immanuel Kant, the definitive Enlightenment philosopher, maybe the definitive modern philosopher, famously came up with his categorical imperative that one should only act in a way that can be universalized. Don't steal, because if everyone stole, then you couldn't have the institution of private property and society would collapse, this kind of thing. His very first example of this principle is suicide. He writes, "To annihilate the subject of morality in one's own person is to root out the existence of morality itself from the world as far as one can, even though morality is an end in itself. Consequently, disposing of oneself as a mere means to some discretionary end is debasing humanity in one's own person." We don't have to go all the way with Kant's terminology to see that he is in the same tradition that stretches from Aristotle to Wittgenstein. Suicide destroys not just a person, but the meaning that person shares with others. This series is hosted by Together for the Common Good, the common good being a major concept in Catholic social thought. And one theme that's run through these lectures is the idea of the commons as a crucial way of imagining what has happened to shared goods in our time. And the previous lectures are very much worth listening to on this subject. Now, the best definition of the common good that I can remember was the one a man gave to his small daughter. The theologians might want to shut their ears. This is probably not the wholly accurate definition of the common good, but we'll try it. When you have a slice of pizza, the father said, that's a private good, because if you eat it, your brother can't eat it. And if he has it, you can't. But when you're watching cartoons, that's a common good, because if he watches it, you can still watch, and it's more fun that way. And he said that he was very proud when his child's teacher said to him, she's telling everyone to come to her birthday party at school because she's saying it's a common good. The thing that's not diminished by being shared and that's actually more itself when it is shared. There was a sort of frantic email exchange this afternoon with me and Jenny and at least one other person in this room about whether I was allowed to say that life is a common good, death is a common bad. There was some discussion about this, which has made me step back from the subject. But you can see the point that when someone dies, we don't just grieve because we won't see them again. That's maybe most of grief, but it's not just that. It's also the destruction of a reality that we shared with them. John Donne very famously said that no man is an island entire of itself. We are connected to each other. Not everybody remembers that he was talking specifically about death. So when you hear the tolling of a bell, he's thinking of 17th century London, you hear in some nearby parish a bell tolling for the dead. You think, oh, maybe that's someone I know. You wonder who it might be. But in a sense, whoever it is, it's your business. Send not to know for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee. If that's true about death, then it helps to explain why suicide has such a shattering effect on those left behind. Human life is obviously full of suffering, even unspeakable suffering. And death is, in a sense, an answer for it. But some silent compact, some shared agreement seems to say that we cannot use death as a tool to solve those problems. And suicide, by breaking that compact, casts our problems too in a different light. Perhaps we too should reach out for the ultimate solution. This helps account for the phenomenon of suicide contagion, which, when it was first theorized, aroused a lot of skepticism, but is now, I think, universally accepted and well established in sociology. It's why journalists are instructed to be extremely careful in reporting on suicides in case they provoke imitations. It's why every other time I Google something about the assisted suicide debate, I get the sponsored ad pop up for the Samaritans. And it's hard to think of another act quite like this, where the mere fact of its happening, or even being discussed, so drastically changes the calculus for everybody else. Again, it shows when we talk about suicide, we're mistaken if we treat it as an autonomous and private act. Again, I'm thinking here primarily about law change. Being human seems to involve suffering alongside others. Staying human, perhaps, means that society has to refuse to establish death as a solution. Now, in that account of the intellectual tradition on suicide, I've drawn on two books by Edith Hall and Jennifer Michael Hecht. And it would be quite unjust, not to mention cheeky, if I didn't acknowledge that both authors distinguish the suicides they're talking about from assisted suicide and euthanasia restricted to the terminally ill. They don't exactly come out and support assisted suicide, but Hall says she wants to keep the conversation separate. And Hecht, in, for me, the weakest part of a generally formidable book, toys with the idea that there might be exceptions to her rule against suicide and that perhaps assisted suicide is among them. And of course, the proponents of the legislation for England and Wales have tried to put up a 12-foot wall between the concept of suicide and the proposal to permit assisted dying. If you watch the second reading debate in the Lords, you'll have noticed the sheer number of the bill's supporters who objected to the very term assisted suicide as offensive and or inaccurate to describe the act of a very ill person who simply decides to cut short the course of their terminal illness. The people we are dealing with, Kim Leadbeater has said, are not suicidal. They very much want to live. They do not want to die, but they are dying. Kit Malthouse, Kim Leadbeater's Tory right-hand man, has said, to some of us, certainly to me, suicide is a healthy person taking their life. But what we are talking about is somebody who is seeking to take control of their inevitable death in these circumstances. For me, those two are qualitatively different. And I'm sure if any of the people trying to push this through Parliament were, for some reason, listening to this lecture, they would long ago have switched off the live stream in exasperation. Why delve so much into the history of suicide when we're talking about a completely different phenomenon? But are they so different? Assisted suicide laws are not just about people in the last weeks of their life. At the most basic level, the current bill says that to qualify, you need a prognosis of 6 months to live. But doctors regard such prognoses as so unreliable that some say you might as well toss a coin. And there's a lot of data to back that up. Government figures suggest that 1 in 5 people who get a 6-month prognosis are still alive and kicking 3 years later. And it's not that unusual to come across people who got a 6-month diagnosis or 6 weeks diagnosis decades ago. And I can see one doctor nodding in the audience. The 6-month definition, as a few disability groups have pointed out, includes a lot of disabled people at some point in their lives. 350 disabled people's organisations in this country are opposed to the bill, none in favour, interestingly. And that's not just because they think, oh, it'll expand over time to include us. It's also because of what's there right now. Moreover, there's no requirement in this bill that your decision to choose assisted suicide has the slightest thing to do with your illness. If your reason is you're depressed, your care costs are too expensive, you find it difficult to cope emotionally with being cared for, you've been let down by public services and you're stuck on a waiting list for the right treatment, you can receive an assisted death under the bill, as long as you tick that box of having a 6-month prognosis. Elsewhere in the world, it's very common for one motive that people list when they're asked why they went for an assisted death to say they feel like a burden. I think in Washington State, it's 59% said it was a reason, perhaps among others, for an assisted suicide. In Australia, there are news reports about people being on a long waiting list for a care package and saying, actually, if I'm going to have to wait that long, I'll get an assisted death. And in Canada, notoriously, people are not that infrequently being offered assisted death because they're disabled, they have complex needs, they have trouble finding the right care, or they're simply miserable. Now, there have been some amendments in the Commons proposed to try and rule out these kind of reasons. So, one was you can't do it because you feel like a burden, but there have been many others aimed at addressing this possibility. And these amendments were invariably rejected on the grounds that the bill is meant to honour autonomy. This is a large part of why the Royal College of Psychiatrists has kicked up such a fuss about the bill. As a college, they don't have a view on assisted suicide per se, though I did get chatting to a psychiatrist at a wedding, and I said, what do you think of your college's stance on this bill? And they said, for me, it could have been even stronger. If you're a psychiatrist who's in favour of assisted suicide, that's like being a cook who's in favour of salmonella. Now, not all psychiatrists feel exactly like that, but they do have at the moment a solemn duty to prevent suicide. That's a big part of their work. And as their Royal College has pointed out, this legislation makes it unclear whether when someone comes to them who is suicidal, they should be trying to help someone out of that state or encourage them down the path to receiving lethal drugs. There's a similar worry, I think, from a lot of palliative care doctors. I spoke to one for an article, Claire Stark-Toller, who's a palliative medicine consultant in Southampton, and she said to me, when patients have a cancer that leaves them paralysed below the waist, they sometimes say, I can't live like this. This is so undignified. 6 weeks later, with the right care, they will often have changed their minds entirely. But, she says, in that time, they could have been killed under this legislation. The more you look at the ramifications of this bill, the more it looks like a bill about suicide, as I've described it. The use of death as a tool to solve a problem. And the consequences of assisted suicide laws bear out the notion, which I went through earlier in the lecture, that death is a social act, that death has broad social consequences, and that to legalise assisted suicide, still more to set up a national suicide service in the heart of the NHS, is to transform the society one is living in. On that specific thing about suicide contagion, for instance, there is some evidence that when places introduce assisted suicide, the rate of unassisted suicides goes up if you do a compare and contrast on US states. There's also the phenomenon of the slippery slope, which is the process by which death as a problem solver is normalized. Countries start out wanting to introduce assisted suicide for this particular small group of people, and they're very nervous about it expanding. So they put in lots of requirements and safeguards. And then over time, they forget why they were so nervous to begin with. Assisted suicide becomes part of the normal toolbox. It becomes a right, or at least it becomes less of a big deal. Major examples are, of course, Belgium, which now has euthanasia for children, the Netherlands, which has seen a surge in people requesting euthanasia for purely psychiatric reasons, Canada, where the numbers have escalated rapidly, and horror stories have poured out of people receiving lethal drugs basically because the health and care system had no more realistic option for them. But you see it in smaller ways as well. In Oregon's law, there's meant to be a psychiatric assessment. If the doctor you go to has a worry, they send you to the psychiatrist. And in the early years, 28% of applicants, more than 1 in 4, would get referred to a psychiatrist. But over time, that's dwindled to 3%. People are just less bothered about the possibility that someone might have depression or some psychiatric problem behind their request. In Australia and New Zealand at the moment, there are big efforts in their respective parliaments to relax the rules on assisted suicide because, again, it's been normalised. People introduce safeguards because they're worried about the law encouraging suicides. After the bill is passed, it becomes more or less normal. I think you can even see this happening in a way in Britain, where we don't even yet have an assisted suicide law, because as with suicide, just the discussion of the possibility and the fact that it's going on shifts people's understanding. I think 10 years ago it was regarded as a much more powerful argument if you said, if we have assisted suicide, people are going to die because they feel like a burden. But now it's quite common to see supporters of the bill saying, that's a legitimate reason, that's a good reason for choosing this way out. And since this bill was proposed, people have felt able to say things which, until recently, would have been considered too barbaric to print. Matthew Paris wrote in the Times last year that, quote, "Our culture is changing its mind about the worth of old age. Your time is up. Will never be in order, but yes, the objectors are right, may one day be the kind of unspoken hint that everybody understands." And that's a good thing. The New Statesman's Ollie Dugmore wrote a couple of months ago that, quote, "We are living longer and that means more medical needs and more care needs. Assisted dying would appear to mitigate some of those problems, curbing the pensions bill, the NHS bill, and the care bill." And he went on to say this: "All over the country, our elders sit in cell blocks, bathed in the stupefying light and sound of bargain hunt, location, 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 tipping point, unvisited by relatives who are preoccupied by the rhythm of their lives, or perhaps unable to summon the courage to witness the degeneration of the once totemic figures of their lives, their mum and dad. Let them die." That is quite a plausible preview of the attitudes likely to take hold in a society which has institutionalized a state suicide service and which treats the provision of lethal drugs as, in effect, another medical treatment, which need not cause any more concern than choosing to go on a course of antibiotics. In short, the question is not just, are the safeguards strong enough? It's, do you want to live in a different kind of country? Some people try and maintain that assisted suicide will only concern a special group of people, the dying, who don't quite count in the same way in terms of suicide prevention. Notably, Stephen Kinnock MP, who is the care minister, and it's reported would probably be the minister for implementing assisted suicide, was asked in the House of Lords committee the other week about people who can't get the care and support they need and therefore request an assisted death. Because it was pointed out to him that under the bill, if someone meets the criteria, even if they really obviously need, some particular form of care or social intervention, if they want to go ahead and they meet the criteria, there's no power for anyone to intervene to ensure that that help is like a real option for them. And the minister's response was as follows: you have to have less than 6 months to live with an irreversible diagnosis. If that threshold is met in terms of eligibility, is that not the key threshold that addresses the question that you're asking? In other words, and I'm slightly caricaturing here, but not caricaturing that much, if people are vulnerable, that doesn't matter if they have 6 months to live. If they request lethal drugs, that request shouldn't be probed too closely. It's natural, or at least within the range of normal human responses. And maybe there's something unpleasantly paternalistic about someone challenging that choice. In this view, the suicide of someone with 50 years to live is more concerning than the suicide of someone with a year to live, which in turn is definitively more concerning than that of someone with 6 months to live. And once you get to the last week, it doesn't really matter at all. Now, even if that were true, this bill would still be unbelievably reckless because the way it's framed draws so many people into its ambit. And because, as we've discussed, these laws always, one way or another, expand. But I do want to pause a bit over whether this is true, whether we should treat the very last stages of life as less in need of safeguarding, less significant than the rest. In 1948, at the Whittington Hospital, not far north from here in Archway, two people fell in love. He was a 40-year-old Polish-Jewish immigrant, and she was the 29-year-old social worker who visited him. Came as something of a surprise to both of them, not just because of the unlikely circumstances, but because neither of them had ever had much romantic success. The social worker had had a couple of boyfriends, but nothing that ever went anywhere, and since childhood she'd struggled with low self-esteem. The Pole had to leave his homeland after falling in love with his friend's wife, and he never really found a foothold in London. He worked as a waiter, didn't really have any friends, didn't really have people around. He felt that he'd wasted his life, and he'd made no impact on the world. And now, at the age of 40, it was all over. Somehow, in the midst of a busy surgical ward of 60 beds, in his conversations with this social worker, he found himself falling for her, and vice versa. And he said to her from his hospital bed, I've waited all my life to find a nice girl, and here you are, and look at me. Their meetings, snatched conversations were brief and few. But the social worker remembered one day when they spent an afternoon laughing together. And at the end of the workday, she recalled, quote, walking back from the 27 bus and thinking, well, if I don't ever have anything else, I've had a perfect afternoon. Less than 2 months after they fell in love, he was dead. And she wrote in her diary the single word, goodbye. But they changed each other's lives, and in a way that would, in turn, change the world of medicine. Because the social worker, whose name was Cecily Saunders, had begun to think, as she sat by the bedside of this man, David Tasmer, isn't there a better way than this to care for those at the end of life? And she and David started to talk about what kind of setting someone with a terminal illness might want to be in. Before he died, David Tasmer said to Cecily Saunders something beautiful and a little cryptic. He said, I'll be a window in your home. That phrase became a kind of touchstone for Cecily Saunders as she developed her thinking about the care of the dying. And that experience of love became the source of her life's mission to treat those with severe life-limiting illness as if they were the most important thing in the world. She was already a qualified nurse as well as a social worker, but in order to do this, she went back to medical school, qualified as a doctor. She began to study intensely all the research on pain control, convinced that this was an area that could be really improved. She started taking opportunities to work in settings like St. Joseph's Hospice in Hackney. She published prolifically on the latest research on pain control. She made connections, became a figure to reckon with in the medical world. And eventually in 1967, she founded St. Christopher's Hospice in Sydenham, which is the beginning of the hospice movement and really of the specialism known as palliative care. I met a doctor who's here tonight who introduced himself and said, you are shaking the hand that has shaken the hand of Cecily Saunders. On the way, she developed a different understanding of pain as not just a physical matter, but something comprising the physical, the mental, the emotional, the spiritual, and the social, as in the whole network of relationships that we're in. And so St. Christopher's would be a place which treated pain in every aspect. Now, a few years before she founded St. Christopher's, in 1961, her life was turned upside down again. And I promise this is true, even though if you read it in a book, you'd think surely this wouldn't happen. She began caring for a terminally ill Polish man, a widow called Antoni Michniewicz, and they fell in love. I won't go into the details of all that. There are two very good biographies by Shirley de Boulay and David Clark, and You can read all about it there. But there's one conversation between them which is really important, I sense, in the history of the hospice movement. Anthony didn't really understand how it was that he could be loved by this doctor and how he could reciprocate it. He would say to her, "I can give you nothing but sorrow." But she managed to get across to him that, on the contrary, he meant everything to her. Shortly before he died, they had the following exchange, as Cecily Saunders described it. "I said that I was a doctor and he was my patient, and we couldn't ever be alone, and I couldn't come as often as I wanted. And he said, 'For me, it is enough.' And I said, 'There has not been anyone like you.' And I tried to say, 'There won't be very long,' but it was so hard to quench his dawning hope. He said, 'I do not understand. I have never done anything for you.' I said, 'I love you just because you are you.' He said, 'Thank you. I love you just because you are you.'" It's impossible to read that line and not think of the most celebrated thing Cecily Saunders ever said when describing the hospice movement. "You matter because you are you. You matter to the last moment of your life, and we will do all we can to help you not only to die peacefully, but also to live until you die." I've had, reporting on this issue, I've had so many doctors quote that to me or send, a follow-up email after an interview being like, "You have to know there's this thing Cecily Saunders said." That statement is a real mission statement for this movement. And it's an amazing fact that the hospice movement, which has since grown to be really one of the great achievements of post-war Britain and one of the most admired achievements of modern medicine, full stop, all around the world, it grows partly out of these two strange, sweet, sad love affairs. Because love cherishes a person not for their usefulness, but simply because they are them, even if they have a terminal illness. Now, if romantic love was one inspiration for the hospice movement, another was a Christian understanding of what it means to be human. Divine love, you could say. When Cecily Saunders converted to Christianity at the age of 27, she discovered, among other things, that she mattered. In her life, she said she'd often felt guilty. She felt that she wasn't good enough. And when she converted, she had for the first time a sense that she, quote, really mattered to the real meaning of things. You matter because you are you. The hospice movement unquestionably has that Christian ethos somewhere at its core, even if it's often been absorbed into a more general spirit of care and compassion. But if you look at the history of the movement, it's very striking that the closest thing to a predecessor for St. Christopher's Hospice in Cecily Saunders' mind was this house in Hackney run by nuns. When she was thinking about what form this first modern hospice would take, St. Christopher's, she went and visited an Anglican convent and thought about founding it as a religious community on that model. And she always thought that the inspiration for the movement was from the Holy Spirit. And she had to overcome some initial skepticism from people in the medical world who were kind of put off by the fairly explicit Christianity of her project. Now, it's an interesting historical question whether the difference between Cecily Saunders' era, which saw amazing advances in the science and practice of care, and our own time, when hospices are struggling to stay afloat while the care sector slowly implodes, whether the difference between those two times is the fact of secularization. A few years ago, the Guardian journalist Madeline Bunting wrote a really good book about the crisis in care, very thoroughly reported with lots of interviews with frontline staff and so on. And I'm going to quote a bit at length because it's very striking and it arises from a lot of first-hand conversations with people in the thick of it in the care system. She says, during the many conversations I had with care workers, the influence of grandparents and parents hovered in the wings. An understanding of care work was often attributed to their example. Interviewees would say, there but for the grace of God go I, or mention the golden rule, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. Of the people I interviewed, a few of the care workers, and several of those caring for their parents, were religious, and their care was grounded in their faith, particularly amongst ethnic minorities. Many more mentioned that their parents and grandparents had been religious, but added that they were not. They still referred to elements of an ethical tradition which had inspired them and provided a sense of worth, yet which they felt was fading. Concepts they held dear, such as duty, kindliness, and even responsibility, were disregarded by their employers and wider society. I think that captures two things about modern Britain. We really do have a noble tradition of care, but also it may soon be running on empty unless we can recover the spirit of Cecily Saunders. You matter because you are you. You matter to the last moment of your life. From everything I've said, you won't be surprised to hear that Cecily Saunders was a resolute and dedicated opponent of every attempt, and there were quite a few in her lifetime, to introduce euthanasia or assisted suicide. If you read her collected letters, it's a kind of running theme. She's often writing to people, trying to make her voice felt in the political process. And a lot of the arguments she used were the ones that we're familiar with in today's debate, that pressure would be placed upon the frail and disabled and elderly, that her phrase, the right to die would soon become a duty to die, not least because people would feel they were too expensive, that bad deaths were almost always a consequence of substandard care, and that was where political effort should be directed. And that although there were certainly some people who wanted death, quote, I am equally sure that they cannot have a law making this possible for them without undermining the right to care of a great many more vulnerable people in need of help. In 1994, she was 76 at the time, and a House of Lords Select Committee issued a report concluding against euthanasia. And she wrote to a friend, I feel very much like a combatant at the end of a long campaign who can at last relax. But something tells me this is probably being too hopeful. However, there are plenty of younger people to take up the baton now. That was over 30 years ago, and the baton has well and truly passed. It seems highly likely that in our lifetimes, this country is going to get poorer and older and harder to govern. But we can still make choices, and this choice about assisted suicide is the biggest one currently on the table. So I look to Cecily Saunders, the greatest Briton of the post-war era, as an inspiration and as a reminder of what we would lose if we were to make death, this old enemy against which humanity has defined itself, into instead a friend. Thank you.
Everyone, we've got lots of questions coming in, so I'm just going to dive straight in, actually. I think we might as well go for the first one, which is anonymous. If the culture continues in the direction you outlined, what signs should we look out for to indicate that we've moved past a tipping point in how life is valued?
Wow, that's a great question on which I don't have a fully worked out answer. I think part of the issue is that it's the boiling frog, that you turn around and a lot of decencies and protections that you assumed were there suddenly aren't there anymore. That seemed to me the case with the committee for the bill in the Commons, because they were trying to put assisted suicide in the best light possible. They invited all these representatives from Australia who were involved with implementing the law to come and turn up and say, it's great, there are no problems, everything works fine. And instead, the Australians kept saying things which sort of horrified everyone. Like, if someone feels like a burden, that's their autonomous choice. And there should be laws against families trying to persuade their loved ones out of assisted suicide. It kind of had a jolt. Now, do I think that the nation of Australia has sunk into total uncivilization? Even during the Ashes, I don't quite think that. But it is clear they have lost some of their instincts, which we still have in quite a short period of time. Yeah.
So we really got to take it seriously, haven't we? Not just sort of wash it away like it's not a big deal.
Yeah.
I mean, we've got to take these things really seriously. The second question, do you have any insights about why the bill was put forward now and under a Labour government?
I mean, there is an organisation which last year had a budget of £3.4 million to spend on campaigning, which is quite a bit more than disability charities or the Association for Palliative Medicine or the British Geriatric Society or Mind or any of the very many civil society groups with a particular concern for the vulnerable who've got concerns can spend on making their views known and doing what they can to have an impact on the political process. I mean, there have been assisted dying bills again and again and again. Obviously, it helped that the Prime Minister, whose position is a little bit complex and ambiguous, was sympathetic to at least having a vote in Parliament. That helped. But in some ways, the issue just keeps coming around again. There's a lot of campaigning heft behind it. And it's not a major issue for the public, but the small section of people who are big on this issue are really big on it and do campaign hard for it.
And where does the money come from, that big sum of money? I mean, is Big Pharma behind this?
I don't think it's known where exactly these large donations come from. I mean, yes, there have been some stories trying to look into this, but it's not entirely clear who are the major people kind of funding the campaign.
Because, I mean, there's huge commercial interest in this bill being passed, isn't it? Because it could open the way to commercial providers.
It certainly could. I mean, I don't know how much money there is to be made out of it. I guess there's money to be made out of everything. And the government have said it could be outsourced. There's no limit in the bill on the profits that can be made from it. So it will definitely be a profitable service. So, yes, all of the issues that have attended privatisation and the impact that's had on healthcare and public services in general are also around the corner with this.
Okay, so 2 questions on palliative care. I'm concerned that legalisation of assisted suicide will reduce investment in palliative care. Do you have evidence to support or challenge that concern? And secondly, is this conversation happening because we're not discussing helpful, supportive and dignified palliative care and reforming in this area of healthcare?
I'm conscious of real expertise in this room, but I'll give it a go. On the first one, there does seem to be quite good evidence that countries which introduce assisted suicide get comparatively less good at doing palliative care. There was a report by Professor David Jones on this, which was very good, and I can't remember the exact stats on it, but there were very noticeable statistics about the countries which had introduced assisted dying falling in the global palliative care rankings, and the states in the US which had introduced assisted suicide having less provision than other states over time, even when you do all of the the things that statisticians do to mean that that's a reasonable comparison. So there's definitely evidence. There's lots of anecdotes of doctors and nurses saying all of our time is being taken up with this new thing we've got to provide. That's just part of it, just energy and resources and time go on it. That report by David Jones is the most thorough report. And the Association for Palliative Medicine here say, I think on the basis of that evidence, that the introduction of assisted dying is impeding the development of palliative care. That seems to be where the evidence points. And I'm sure it's true that the public campaign for assisted suicide benefits from, as I say, the much smaller megaphone available to people in the palliative care sector and who could make the case for it. But who are often sort of appalled at the misrepresentations of the dying process, which are used to gin up support in Parliament.
Okay. The next question is anonymous. In Canada, campaigners are trying to ensure competent minors do not need parental permission for assisted suicide. Where will this end? What is the ultimate goal?
I don't know if it has a goal. In a way, it has a mind of its own. But the logic is completely flawless. If it's good that people have this right to an assisted death if they're suffering, what's the principle by which we take away that right from mentally competent children? You know, are we saying that they're second-class citizens? Okay, maybe we do in some respects, but we don't in others. Certainly with medical treatment, it would be very odd to say because you're a child, even though there's this treatment you want, you can't have it. A lot hinges on that question of whether something is a treatment, because if I understand it correctly, then if something is classed as a treatment, doctors don't really have the right to say this isn't available to you. You know, you've got to offer the options. Once you've crossed that line, it makes sense to offer it to children. Once you've crossed that line, well, if a 2-year-old is really suffering, then maybe there should be euthanasia for infants as well.
This is very dark, isn't it?
It is, and the darkness creeps up quite slowly. I think that this is why it is a bright line between having an assisted suicide law and not having an assisted suicide law.
Okay. Bartek asks, where do we draw the line for permitting self-sacrifice? For example, what about heroic suicides in war?
Good. That's a great question. Yes. So, I mean, this is somewhat off the topic of whether assisted suicide should be legalized, but yes, if a commanding officer throws himself on a grenade to save his men, then is that a suicide to which all of the suspicion and concern that I outlined in that lecture should apply? I suppose the answer to that is if the commanding officer throws himself on the grenade and miraculously it doesn't go off, he hasn't failed. He hasn't failed in what he was trying to do. Like, his goal was not to end his life. And so, in a sense, it shouldn't be considered a suicide in that same way of using death as a tool.
Okay. Anonymous. Either life is gift and good irrespective of its conditions, the sheer goodness of the givenness of being, or its value is always contingent. Seems to be a statement rather than a question. Yeah. What do you think of that?
Either.
Life is gift and good irrespective of its conditions, the sheer goodness of the givenness of being, or its value is always contingent.
Yeah, that sounds about right. That's, I suppose, part of what I was saying, that when we put conditions on whether life is to be valued, we've sort of already fallen into something quite dark.
Okay. Arpith in this room asks, why are people often vastly more comfortable with someone being euthanized or than assisted, as if we find the suicide more troubling than murder?
are people more comfortable with people being euthanized? That's an interesting one. Definitely the people prefer euthanasia to assisted suicide if they have the choice. If it's a choice between you take the pills or press the button and the doctor administers it himself, I think the statistics everywhere are sort of more than 90% of people tend to say they want the doctor to do it, which is psychologically interesting. Certainly here, it seems to be the feeling of the people pushing this that, I suppose this does confirm the question, that euthanasia is something people are more squeamish about, like the actual doctor with the lethal substance they're going to inject into you. Mm-hmm. And so there's been a decision to restrict it to assisted suicide. Mm-hmm. Even though I don't think there's a real logic for that. Mm-hmm. It is just that people are more, as in there's not a legal logic for it, but people recognise there's an emotional response that people have. Maybe it's a more visible corruption of the doctor's role as a caregiver, off the top of my head. Kevin's nodding, so there must be something in that.
Here's a longer question. What are we as a society set to lose if we end the lives of those who are needy? Christian charity workers know everyone has something to give. So Pope Francis and Pope Leo II says we need to be evangelized by the poor, that reciprocity, not the service provider model. It's the way of transformation for all of us. If the chaotic alcoholic in and out of hostels who's attempted suicide perhaps before, or the homeless woman who cannot manage a stable life, if they accept the offer of assisted suicide, what do we lose when they are gone? What happens to society if we remove the poor from our lives in this way?
Yeah, it's a very profound question. You could answer that Pope Francis, because, one of the best things he said was that children who don't have the experience of caring for the sick relatives, are being deprived. That's very powerful, this idea that it's a kind of deprivation in not being able to do this very human thing of caring.
It reminds me of something Michael Sandel said back in 2009, and it was actually about the ability to choose the colour of your children's eyes, that sort of playing God type of thing. And he was saying it's so important for us to stay open to the unbidden. Yeah, I thought it was a beautiful phrase. So that sense of, if we remove the problems that society is identifying, does it make us stronger or weaker?
Yeah. So there's clearly something wrong with this aim to tidy up society by getting rid of all the people we don't quite know what to deal with. And I think we can all recognise that. And it's why it's so terrible that in Canada, so many people who are just in dire situations, have doctors say, well, have you considered?
I think people find this really hard to believe that it's actually happening.
Yeah.
There are lots of stories.
Yeah. There was a very good piece about it in The Atlantic, a very good, very long piece all about that, which had in it the image supplied by a doctor who carries out euthanasia and had become increasingly disturbed as it became clearer and clearer that not everybody, because it often happens in people's homes, not everybody has a kind of nice, comfy home surrounded by a warm family when this happens. And this doctor had an image of, being in a completely bare room with just someone on a mattress on the floor and delivering that dose of lethal drugs to them, thinking, this doesn't quite seem right. This is wandering from the question about what we lose if we lose the poor. It's a theological question, really. Yeah.
There's two sort of associated questions really that follow on from that. One is there a risk of assisted suicide being used to reduce the overcrowding in prisons? The other is part of the problem that we delegate elderly care to the state so much now, and they are no longer part of a valued part of family life. And I suppose that also points to another question I wanted to ask you was, what do you think about the reform of the state? I mean, in terms of the welfare system and the care system. I mean, we are in a perfect storm now, aren't we? We have very high rates of loneliness, which, basically are a product of this hyperliberal system, which atomizes and separates people. And also, we've now got assisted dying probably coming down the track at the same time, and people are supposed to avoid the feeling of being a burden, when they may already feel that they don't matter to anyone. This is becoming an acute situation now. So what would you say about reform of care of the elderly? I think you mentioned earlier that care homes are not prepared for this. They weren't consulted.
Yeah, there's sort of three questions there, including yours, Jenny. Overcrowding in prisons. I mean, that seems very dark, but then, as I say, things do get dark quite quickly. And there was an amendment proposed in the Commons to exempt prisoners, and that was rejected, partly because it could fall foul of human rights legislation to not give prisoners their right to an assisted death. I think that issue is going to come up in the Lords as well, whether prisoners and the homeless will be exempt from the legislation. I mean, it does connect to your question, which I'll come on to, about the state of public services. I'm sure that's true, that as it become... I mean, the same is true at the beginning of life, right, that for families, that it has just become harder for families to become places of care. It's not something public policy thinks about very much or tries to prioritise, and I'm sure that's part of the reason we have both a crisis of public services and why this looks so plausible as a public policy choice to have assisted suicide. And then, I mean, as for reform of care and reform of the state, that is maybe the defining policy challenge, is how do we remain a caring society when the sort of material basis for that is vanishing? And so many of the things that we relied on as, the state will naturally provide that, it now seems the state can only provide in a threadbare way and is still bankrupt, and the Chancellor is breaking down in tears and we don't know what to do. I mean, it's a huge set of interlocking questions. Every time you look at it, it gets worse, and I hope there are some very bright people thinking about it. I don't know what the set of policies is. I just know there is one policy which in that context is absolutely catastrophically bad.
We do have to draw it to a close, I'm afraid. There's so many questions that we haven't been able to answer. But this reminds me of that Stanley Hauerwas quote, where he says about what it means to be a Christian or a Christian witness, that, in the future, if we're known as the people who don't kill their children or their elderly and care for them, then we'll be doing something right. And it kind of points to potentially... in quite a dystopian future, that what does it mean to be a Christian? If we do have a different set of values, and you said if we are moving into a blueprint for a different kind of society, there may be a challenge for us there. And in terms of the reform of the state, if some of it requires that more responsibility is taken back in the family or in community, that's going to ask quite a big cultural shift. But that's certainly, I think, a role for Christian communities.
Yeah, totally agree with that.
To take on. Dan, thank you so much. It's been extraordinarily rich. Feels like it's gone by very, very quickly. I think what is so striking here is the recognition of not only how far we have strayed, but also how profound the implications of this change are going to be. It may feel like a bad dream, but as we've just heard, we are in fact on the brink of becoming a different kind of country. This historical context has been so helpful, but Dan has also given us a narrative about what it means to care for each other, about love, about the meaning of life and death, a story that we can take forward a story about what it takes to stay human in an age that places individual choice over the common good. I think this talk reveals the deeper purpose of Christian witness in our time, to bear witness to the truth of what it means to be human. This is on each of us. It's too important to leave to others. So I hope that you might consider sharing this episode with a friend and then discuss together how you can respond. I'm still inspired by our friend, the late Frank Field, who was prepared to face the difficult questions with courage, grace, and truth. We have to do the same now. Thank you for listening to the Together for the Common Good podcast. Do find out about the other strands of our work. As well as public talks like this one, we produce online resources, give talks for Christian leaders, train teachers to deliver our Common Good Schools program, and co-host the Leaving Egypt podcast, exploring what it means to be God's people in these times of unravelling. We're a very small charity making a big impact. Inspired by Catholic social thought, we do this by working across the Christian traditions through many partnerships and on very little money. The demand for this work is growing, and we need your help. The best way to get involved is to become a paid subscriber on the Together for the Common Good Substack. Join us, only £5 a month, and be inspired and equipped to play your part in spiritual and civic renewal as we work together for the common good. Find us at t4cg.substack.com. Thanks for listening. Until next time, goodbye and God bless.